The life of Ricky Nelson is one of the most striking paradoxes in American entertainment history. To the public, he appeared to be born lucky, handsome, talented, wealthy, and surrounded by fame from the moment he could walk. Yet behind the polished image of a perfect television family was a childhood shaped less by freedom than by obligation, discipline, and relentless exposure. Ricky Nelson did not stumble into stardom. He was raised inside it, molded by it, and in many ways, trapped by it long before he was old enough to understand the cost. Ricky was born on May 8, 1940, into a family where show business was not just a career, but a way of life. His father, Ozzie Nelson, was a respected bandleader and producer, while his mother, Harriet Nelson, was already an established actress. Fame surrounded Ricky from infancy. The family radio program, later transformed into the wildly successful television series The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, turned their private lives into a form of serialized entertainment. Unlike later reality television, this was presented as wholesome fiction, but the characters were real people playing idealized versions of themselves. Ricky grew up watching his own childhood become a national spectacle. By the time he was 8 years old, Ricky had joined the show alongside his older brother, David. While other children learned who they were through friendships, mistakes, and play, Ricky learned himself through scripts, rehearsals, and audience reactions. His playground was a studio, his schedule dictated by production demands rather than school bells or seasons. The applause came early, but so did the pressure. He became a household name before reaching double digits, praised for his natural charm and quiet presence, yet deprived of the anonymity that allows a child to develop without scrutiny. Complicating matters further was Ricky's fragile health. He suffered from severe asthma, a condition that frequently kept him isolated indoors, away from other children. While his peers ran freely, Ricky observed from the sidelines, listening to records, absorbing music, and growing inward rather than outward. This isolation shaped his personality. He became soft-spoken, introspective, and emotionally reserved, traits that later translated into his on-screen appeal, but also masked a deep sense of loneliness. The audience saw confidence. The reality was a boy struggling simply to breathe and feel normal. As the family's television success grew, so did the blurring of reality and performance. Family dinners doubled as rehearsals, and their Los Angeles home became an iconic symbol of American domestic bliss. Yet behind the scenes, it functioned like a corporate headquarters. Ozzie Nelson ran the household with the precision of a producer, and the children were employees as much as sons. Ricky's identity was shaped not by personal choice, but by what worked for the brand. This was the foundation upon which Ricky Nelson's entire life would be built. Immense success paired with limited control, early admiration coupled with delayed self-discovery. Long before fame made him rich, it had already made him vulnerable. As Ricky Nelson entered his teenage years, fame stopped being a backdrop and became the defining force of his identity. By the mid-1950s, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet was one of the most watched television programs in America. Millions of viewers tuned in each week, watching the Nelson family live out a carefully curated version of domestic perfection. Ricky was no longer simply a child actor. He was a symbol of American youth, carefully protected, polished, and monetized. Yet beneath that clean image, something far more complicated was forming. In 1957, when Ricky was just 17, everything changed. His performance of I'm Walkin' on the family's television show electrified audiences. Teenagers across the country instantly latched onto him, and record sales followed at a staggering pace. What had begun as a television role now expanded into a full-scale music career. His debut singles sold over 1 million copies, and his first album climbed to the top of the charts, making him the youngest artist at the time to achieve such success. Overnight, Ricky Nelson was no longer just a TV star. He was a commercial phenomenon. This success, however, was not accidental. It was engineered. Ozzie Nelson recognized the unique promotional power of television long before most producers did. At the end of each episode, Ricky would perform a new song, effectively turning a sitcom into a weekly music advertisement. Millions of households became captive audiences, and songs that might have taken months to gain traction on radio soared up the charts in days. When Poor Little Fool reached #1 on the newly created Billboard Hot 100 in 1958, it secured Ricky's place in music history. He became the first artist ever to top that chart, a distinction that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet while the public saw effortless success, Ricky's personal autonomy remained limited. Despite earning substantial income, his father maintained strict control over his finances. Ricky received an allowance, not a fortune. The logic was discipline and protection, but the effect was dependency. He was old enough to headline concerts and sign record deals, yet not trusted to manage the money he generated. This imbalance would later prove disastrous, as Ricky never fully learned how to control his finances or plan for life beyond peak fame. As his popularity grew, so did the tension between his public image and private behavior. On screen, he was the polite, clean-cut boy next door. Off-screen, he was a restless teenager exploring freedom for the first time. Parties, fast cars, and secret relationships became part of his life. Some of these romances would have shocked his fans had they been public. Ricky was not reckless out of malice, but out of curiosity and rebellion. After years of control, he was searching for identity in the only ways he knew. This rebellion alarmed his parents, especially Ozzy, who feared scandal above all else. Romantic rumors were quickly shut down, and serious relationships were discouraged. Love, in their view, was a distraction that threatened the carefully managed image of the Nelson family brand. The more Ricky earned, the tighter the grip became. Fame had given him everything, yet denied him the right to live freely within it. By the early 1960s, Ricky attempted to assert creative independence. Frustrated with session musicians who dismissed rock and roll as a passing fad, he formed his own band and demanded control over his sound. This decision was costly but empowering. It marked the first time Ricky chose respect over convenience. For a brief moment, it seemed he might transition from manufactured teen idol into a serious, self-directed musician. But the industry was changing fast. In 1964, the British invasion, led by the Beatles, reshaped popular music overnight. Tastes shifted, charts reset, and former idols struggled to adapt. Ricky, once untouchable, found himself fighting to stay relevant. His songs no longer dominated the airwaves, and the certainty that had defined his early career began to fade. By the end of this period, Ricky Nelson stood at a crossroads. He had achieved historic success before adulthood, yet lacked the tools to navigate decline. The system that built him had never prepared him for change. What lay ahead would test not only his career, but his marriage, finances, and ultimately his survival. By the mid-1960s, the life of Ricky Nelson had entered a phase defined not by ascent, but by resistance. The industry that once elevated him now demanded reinvention at a pace he had never been trained to handle. Ricky was no longer the teenage sensation effortlessly carried by television exposure and novelty. He was a young man confronting artistic doubt, financial strain, and personal responsibility, all while the audience that once adored him began to look elsewhere. One of the most significant turning points in Ricky's life was his relationship with Kristen Chris Harmon. On the surface, their pairing looked like a Hollywood fairy tale. Chris came from an equally famous lineage, the daughter of football legend Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox, and the sister of future television star Mark Harmon. The union seemed perfect in the eyes of the public. Two beautiful, famous young people raised under the same spotlight. In reality, it was a marriage born of pressure rather than readiness. When they married in 1963, Chris was already pregnant, and the wedding happened quickly under strict conditions imposed by her family. Ricky, not Catholic, was required to make formal promises about religion and parenting that he had little say in. It was another moment in his life where control came from the outside, not from within. Marriage did not bring stability. Instead, it introduced a new kind of strain. Ricky had grown up with financial discipline imposed by his father, but he had never learned to manage money independently. Chris, raised in comfort and privilege, expected a lifestyle that reflected their celebrity status. Expensive homes, luxury cars, designer clothes, and constant travel became normal. Even as Ricky's chart success slowed, the spending did not. To keep up, he toured relentlessly, often playing smaller venues for less money, stretching himself physically and emotionally to maintain appearances. Artistically, Ricky was determined not to live in the shadow of his own past. He shortened his name from Ricky to Rick, a symbolic attempt to shed the teen idol image that clung to him. He formed new bands, experimented with country rock sounds, and surrounded himself with musicians who respected his vision rather than dismissing it. This era produced some of his most sincere and forward-thinking work, but it arrived at the wrong moment. The audience wanted nostalgia. Promoters wanted hits. Radio wanted familiarity. Rick wanted evolution. That conflict reached a breaking point in 1971 at a rock and roll concert at Madison Square Garden. Rick stepped onto the stage, hoping to be heard as the artist he had become. Instead, he was met with boos. The crowd wanted the old songs, the old image, the boy they remembered from television. To Rick, the message was devastating. It wasn't just rejection of a performance. It was rejection of his growth. He eventually returned to the stage and played the classics, receiving applause, but the emotional damage was done. That night confirmed his deepest fear. The audience loved the memory of him more than the man standing before them. Out of that humiliation came one of the most honest songs of his career. In 1972, Rick released Garden Party, a reflective response to the Madison Square Garden incident. Its message was simple but profound. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. The song resonated deeply, climbing into the top 10 and earning gold certification. For a brief moment, Rick reclaimed relevance on his own terms. It was not the explosive success of his youth, but it was something more meaningful, validation that his voice still mattered. Unfortunately, that resurgence was short-lived. Follow-up singles failed to gain traction, and record labels grew uncertain about how to market him. By the mid-1970s, Rick found himself performing at amusement parks and accepting minor television roles, a far cry from sold-out concerts and chart-topping records. The industry that once depended on him now quietly moved on. At home, the situation worsened. Years of financial stress, constant touring, and emotional distance eroded his marriage. Arguments became routine, trust disappeared, and the house that once symbolized success turned into a battleground. By the late 1970s, the marriage collapsed in dramatic fashion. Rick returned from tour one day to find himself locked out of his own home, his belongings removed, and his family life effectively over. The separation quickly escalated into a bitter divorce filled with accusations, legal maneuvering, and public humiliation. The divorce would prove financially catastrophic. Legal fees alone exceeded $1 million, draining what little security Rick had left. When the settlement was finalized in the early 1980s, he was ordered to pay substantial monthly child support while sharing custody of his 4 children. Despite decades of success, Rick was now close to broke. To meet his obligations, he toured nonstop, often under exhausting conditions, sacrificing health and stability simply to stay afloat. Emotionally, Rick was worn down. The confidence that once carried him through adolescence was replaced by fatigue and quiet resignation. He had spent his life working to satisfy others, his parents, his audience, his industry, and now, in middle age, he found himself chasing survival rather than fulfillment. The irony was brutal. He had done everything expected of him, and yet nothing had prepared him for this stage of life. By the early 1980s, Rick was desperate for a comeback, or at least for financial relief. He was no longer flying commercially, having developed a deep fear of flying, but he also refused to travel by bus. In an attempt to save money and maintain control, he purchased a used 1944 Douglas DC-3 aircraft. The plane was old, unreliable, and plagued with mechanical issues. Band members and crew members feared it. Some refused to fly on it altogether. Warnings were frequent, but Rick ignored them. He could not afford cancellations. He needed the income. What followed would transform Rick Nelson's story from a tale of slow decline into a full-scale tragedy. The choices he made in desperation, financial, professional, and personal, were setting the stage for an ending no one could reverse. And yet, even as his life appeared to be unraveling, the true value of his legacy remained hidden, waiting to be discovered long after he was gone. By 1985, the life of Ricky Nelson had narrowed to a grim routine defined by obligation rather than ambition. He was no longer chasing fame in the traditional sense. He was chasing solvency. Each tour stop, each small venue, each late-night performance was less about artistry and more about survival. Child support payments, legal debts, and years of unchecked spending had reduced one of America's most successful recording artists to a man living gig to gig. The pressure was relentless, and it pushed him toward decisions that would ultimately cost him everything. Rick had always hated flying, but commercial travel meant schedules he could not control and expenses he could not justify. Tour buses, while safer, were slower and expensive. In an attempt to regain control and cut costs, he purchased a used aircraft, a 1944 Douglas DC-3, for a relatively modest sum. The plane carried history and nostalgia, having once belonged to another music legend, but sentimentality could not disguise its condition. The aircraft was plagued with mechanical failures, unreliable engines, and persistent maintenance issues. Band members were openly afraid of it. Wives begged their husbands not to board. Emergency landings were not hypothetical. They had already happened. Warnings came from every direction, but Rick ignored them. He felt trapped by math more than fear. Canceling shows meant losing income he could not afford to lose. Replacing the plane meant spending money he did not have. In his mind, the risk was acceptable because the alternative was financial collapse. It was a calculation made under duress, one that left no margin for error. On December 31st, 1985, the plane was scheduled to fly Rick and his band to Dallas for a New Year's Eve performance. Mechanical issues delayed the flight for hours, but eventually, the decision was made to proceed. Shortly after takeoff, smoke filled the cabin. Visibility dropped to near zero. The pilots struggled to maintain control as the aircraft descended toward a small landing strip in Texas. Witnesses later described the plane flying low, trailing thick black smoke, before clipping trees and erupting into flames just short of the runway. The crash was violent and final. Rick Nelson was killed instantly, along with his fiancée, Helen Blair, and several members of his band and crew. Only the pilot survived, escaping through cockpit windows. Rick was 45 years old. The man who had defined teenage stardom in America, who had sold millions of records and helped shape the modern music industry, was gone in an instant. The shock rippled through the entertainment world, but what followed was not a dignified reckoning with his legacy. It was chaos. In the immediate aftermath, reports surfaced that Rick had died nearly broke. His finances were in disarray, burdened by debt, legal fees, and the cost of maintaining the aging aircraft that had killed him. To many observers, the story seemed tragically simple. A former star who spent too much, earned too little in later years, and paid the ultimate price. But the reality was far more complex and far more disturbing. At first, it appeared Rick had died without a valid will. His ex-wife moved quickly to position herself in control of the estate, arguing that there was little left anyway. Then, months later, Rick's brother produced a will dated just 4 months before the crash. The document changed everything. It named only Rick's 4 children as heirs and appointed his brother as executor. His ex-wife was excluded. His mother was excluded. His fiancée, who had died alongside him, was excluded as well. The will made Rick's intentions clear, but it also opened the door to years of bitter legal warfare. The lawsuits came fast and from every direction. Creditors filed claims. Family members challenged the executor. Insurance disputes dragged on. One particularly painful case involved a son Rick had fathered outside of his marriage. Though paternity had been proven in court years earlier, Rick had explicitly excluded the child from his will, citing disputed claims. After Rick's death, the child's mother fought for a share of the estate, but the courts upheld the will. The decision left one son with nothing while his siblings stood to inherit whatever remained. As the legal battles intensified, another truth began to surface, one that would redefine Rick Nelson's story. His real fortune had never been in houses, cars, or cash reserves. It was in his music. Decades of hit songs, television performances, and historic recordings continued to generate income long after his death. The problem was that much of that income had never reached him or his heirs. Years after the crash, forensic accountants and lawyers uncovered evidence that record companies had been systematically underpaying Rick's royalties for decades. Outdated accounting practices, questionable deductions, and opaque reporting had siphoned millions from his catalog. Digital sales and streaming revenue, in particular, were being calculated using formulas designed for physical media, dramatically reducing payouts. Money that should have gone to Rick during his lifetime, and to his children afterward, had quietly disappeared into corporate ledgers. When the estate finally challenged the record labels in court, the numbers were staggering. The lawsuits alleged that tens, possibly hundreds, of millions of dollars had been withheld through deliberate misclassification and accounting manipulation. What had once looked like financial irresponsibility on Rick's part began to resemble something far darker: exploitation. He had not simply spent his fortune. Much of it had never been paid to him at all. Settlements followed years later, some undisclosed, others public, resulting in massive payouts and increased royalty rates going forward. Rick's children, who had once feared inheriting nothing but debt, suddenly found themselves beneficiaries of a legacy far larger than anyone had imagined. The irony was bitter. The fortune that could have secured Rick's life and spared him desperation only emerged after his death. Unlocked by legal action, he was never able to pursue himself. In the end, Rick Nelson's story became a cautionary tale not just about fame, but about systems that profit from talent while obscuring truth. He was a pioneer, a product, and ultimately a victim of an industry that celebrated him loudly and paid him quietly. His death closed one chapter, but the revelations that followed forced the world to reconsider what had really been taken from him, and who had benefited most while he struggled to survive. In the years following the legal settlements, the story of Ricky Nelson took on a meaning far larger than a single tragic life. What emerged was not merely the correction of past accounting errors, but a profound exposure of how the music industry had operated for decades, quietly profiting from complexity, obscurity, and the assumption that artists, especially those from earlier eras, would never have the leverage or stamina to fight back. Ricky Nelson's legacy became a symbol of delayed justice, achieved too late for the man himself, but transformative for those who came after him. When Ricky was alive, the idea that record labels might be systematically underpaying artists was whispered but rarely proven. Contracts from the 1950s and 1960s were filled with dense language, vague royalty definitions, and clauses that overwhelmingly favored corporations. Artists trusted managers, lawyers, and labels to act in good faith. Ricky, raised in an environment where others controlled his career and finances from childhood, was particularly vulnerable. He relied on systems that were never designed to protect him. As long as the checks arrived and the career continued, there was little reason or energy to question the math. Digital technology changed everything. As music shifted from vinyl and CDs to downloads and streaming, massive new revenue streams emerged. Ironically, it was this modern transformation that exposed decades-old wrongdoing. Labels applied outdated deductions such as breakage fees, originally intended to account for damaged physical records, to digital sales where no physical loss existed. Entire categories of income were labeled unmatched or unallocated, allowing companies to retain funds without clear accountability. These practices disproportionately affected artists whose catalogs continued to perform long after their commercial peak. Ricky's estate became one of the first to challenge this system at scale. The lawsuits were not simple royalty disputes. They were forensic examinations of how money moved inside the industry. Auditors uncovered patterns that suggested underpayment was not accidental but structural. The amounts involved were staggering. What initially appeared to be modest discrepancies grew into claims worth hundreds of millions of dollars. When settlements were reached, they sent shockwaves through the business. Confidential figures circulated quietly, but insiders understood the significance. This was not just a win for one family. It was a warning. For Ricky's children, the impact was life-altering. They had grown up watching their father struggle, tour relentlessly, and ultimately die under the weight of financial pressure. For years, the public narrative painted him as a cautionary tale of excess and decline. The settlements rewrote that narrative. Their father had not failed financially in the way history suggested. He had been deprived. The fortune that finally reached them was not a windfall. It was restitution. Emotionally, this revelation reframed Ricky Nelson's life. His desperate touring schedule, his refusal to cancel shows, his decision to fly on a dangerous aircraft, all of it took on a new dimension. These were not merely poor choices made by a fading star. They were the decisions of a man trying to survive within a system that had quietly withheld what he had earned. The tragedy of his death became inseparable from the injustice that preceded it. Culturally, Ricky's case arrived at a moment when artists were beginning to demand transparency. Younger musicians, armed with digital platforms and social media, could now speak directly to fans and expose unfair practices in real time. The success of the Nelson estate strengthened their position. It demonstrated that even the most powerful corporations were vulnerable when confronted with evidence and persistence. Lawyers began referencing the case in negotiations. Estates revisited old contracts. Audits became more common. The industry, slowly and reluctantly, began to change. Yet there was an unavoidable bitterness in the outcome. Ricky Nelson did not live to see vindication. He did not experience financial security in his final years. He did not benefit from the reforms his case helped inspire. Instead, his name became associated with a lesson learned at the highest possible cost. That tension between justice achieved and life lost defines the lasting emotional weight of his story. In hindsight, Ricky's life reads less like a fall from grace and more like a long-term extraction. From childhood onward, value was generated around him through television ratings, record sales, advertising, and cultural influence. But control over that value consistently rested elsewhere. By the time he reached adulthood, the patterns were already entrenched. He worked, others accounted. He performed, others decided. He trusted, others benefited. What makes Ricky Nelson's legacy endure is not just his music, though his songs remain foundational to American pop and rock history. It is the clarity his story provides about the true cost of early fame and institutional imbalance. He was not reckless by nature. He was inexperienced, overmanaged, and underprotected. The system that celebrated him as a pioneer offered little support when novelty faded and the bills remained. Today, Ricky Nelson is remembered not only as a teenage idol or a tragic figure, but as a turning point. His posthumous victories forced an industry to confront its past. His children's inheritance became a public reckoning. And his life, once dismissed as a cautionary tale of personal failure, now stands as evidence that talent alone is never enough when power and transparency are absent. In the end, Ricky Nelson did leave behind a fortune, one so large it shocked the courts and reshaped perceptions. But the true legacy he left was far more important than money. He left proof. Proof that exploitation can hide in plain sight. Proof that justice can arrive decades late. And proof that, even in death, a voice silenced too early can still change the rules for those who follow. As the dust settled from the legal victories, the legacy of Ricky Nelson began to assume its final and most enduring form. His story was no longer framed solely by tragedy, scandal, or posthumous wealth, but by a deeper understanding of what his life revealed about fame, family, and the systems that surround young talent. With time and distance, Ricky Nelson emerged not as a cautionary stereotype, but as a human case study in how success can coexist with vulnerability and how easily one can be mistaken for the other. For the public, Ricky's image had always been frozen in extremes. To older generations, he was forever the clean-cut teenage idol smiling from black and white television screens. To others, he became a symbol of decline, a once famous star who struggled, overspent, and died too soon. What was missing from both views was context. Ricky had been working continuously since childhood, conditioned to perform, comply, and adapt without ever being taught how to pause, evaluate, or protect himself. His adulthood did not begin on equal footing with those who discovered fame later in life. It began already burdened with expectations and habits formed in a controlled environment. In reassessing his career, music historians have increasingly recognized Ricky's influence as broader than chart positions suggest. He was one of the first artists to successfully merge television exposure with pop music marketing, creating a template that would later be replicated by countless performers. His willingness to shift from pop to country rock in the late 1960s anticipated trends that would not fully take hold until years later. At a time when reinvention was risky and often punished, Ricky pursued artistic growth even when it cost popularity. That choice, once viewed as a misstep, is now seen as evidence of integrity. Equally important is the reassessment of his personal life. The narrative of reckless spending and poor judgment has softened under scrutiny. While Ricky certainly made mistakes, the broader picture reveals a man who was never fully equipped to manage sudden decline. He had earned millions, yet lived without true financial literacy. He was surrounded by professionals, yet rarely by advocates whose sole priority was his long-term well-being. When success waned, the support structure evaporated, leaving him to navigate adulthood with tools designed for adolescence. For his children, Ricky's legacy is both painful and empowering. They lost their father young, witnessed his struggles, and endured years of public speculation about his life and death. The eventual financial settlements brought security, but they also brought clarity. Their father's story was not one of simple failure, but of systemic imbalance. That understanding allowed them to reclaim his name, speak openly about his life, and participate in preserving his artistic legacy on their own terms. Within the music industry, Ricky Nelson's case continues to resonate as a benchmark. It stands as a reminder that exploitation does not always look dramatic in the moment. Sometimes it appears as routine accounting, as contracts signed in good faith, as small deductions repeated over decades. Ricky's posthumous victories helped legitimize long-standing grievances and encouraged artists and estates to demand transparency. His name is now cited alongside other landmark cases that reshaped how royalties are calculated and reported in the digital era. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Ricky Nelson's life is that early success can be as dangerous as it is dazzling. Fame arrived before identity, money before independence, and responsibility before choice. Ricky lived much of his life responding to forces he did not create, making decisions under pressure rather than from security. His final years, often portrayed as decline, were in reality a prolonged struggle for equilibrium in a system that had already moved on. Today, when his music is streamed, licensed, or rediscovered by new generations, it carries a weight beyond nostalgia. Each song is evidence of a talent that shaped popular culture and a man whose value was underestimated in his lifetime. Ricky Nelson did not simply leave behind a fortune. He left behind a mirror held up to the entertainment industry, reflecting both its brilliance and its blind spots. In the end, his story endures because it refuses to fit neatly into triumph or tragedy alone. It is both, and in that complexity lies its power. The story of Ricky Nelson ultimately resists a simple conclusion. It does not end cleanly with success, nor does it settle comfortably into tragedy. Instead, it lingers as a reminder that fame, when encountered too early and managed by others, can shape a life in ways that are difficult to undo. Ricky's journey forces a reconsideration of how society measures achievement and failure, especially in those who rise before they have the chance to choose who they want to be. Ricky spent his entire life performing. From the moment he could speak, his image, voice, and personality were part of a larger commercial machine. He learned discipline, professionalism, and resilience at an age when most children are learning play. That training made him exceptional, but it also deprived him of the space to develop independence. By the time the spotlight dimmed, he was left navigating adulthood without the safety nets that ordinary experience provides. His struggles in later years were not sudden collapses, but the delayed consequences of a life lived under constant supervision. What makes Ricky Nelson's legacy endure is the contrast between perception and reality. To the public, he seemed to have everything: talent, money, recognition, and opportunity. In truth, control over his own life was often the one thing he lacked. Even at his most successful, financial decisions were made for him. Relationships were discouraged or managed, and creative choices were constrained by what preserved the family brand. When that structure disappeared, so did the protection it had provided, leaving Ricky exposed to risks he was never trained to manage alone. His death, shocking and preventable in hindsight, became a symbolic endpoint to years of quiet desperation. Yet it was not the end of his impact. The legal battles that followed revealed how much of his labor had gone uncompensated, how deeply embedded unfair practices were within the music industry, and how easily the struggles of artists could be misinterpreted as personal failure. The fortune uncovered after his passing did not erase the tragedy, but it reframed it. Ricky Nelson had not simply lost his way. He had been carrying the weight of an imbalance he could not see. Today, Ricky is remembered not just as a teenage idol or a fallen star, but as a figure who helped change how the industry treats its past. His story contributed to greater awareness, stronger advocacy, and increased transparency for artists and their families. New generations encounter his music without the baggage of old narratives, hearing instead a voice that helped define an era and quietly pushed against its limitations. In the end, Ricky Nelson's life serves as both warning and testament. It warns of the costs of early fame and unchecked power, but it also testifies to resilience, creativity, and the enduring value of truth. His voice was silenced too soon, but the echoes of his story continue, asking not how much he earned, but how much he gave and why it took so long for the world to understand the difference.